Likkutei Sichos, Chelek Beis, volume 22, the third Sicha for Parshas Emor. This is a wonderful explanation about the mitzvah of the Daled Minim, that's the four species that we take together on Sichos, specifically insight into the Arava, the willow branch, and also the lulav. Just as a quick introduction, something that will help us better appreciate the Sicha, we know that the Torah can be explained in four ways. Pardes, Pshat, Remez, Drush, Soid. Pshat means the simple, basic understanding, just a clear meaning of the words, the verse, the saying. Then there is Remez, which are basically the hints, the allusions that are there in the Psukim. Then there's Drash. Drash is more like the Midrash, gets a deeper meaning or homiletics of the thing. And then there's a Soid, there's a secret. Now, we know that the rule is that the Gemara says, Ein lemedim halacha min haggadah. You cannot derive an actual rule, a halacha, a specific ruling of how one has to behave, legally speaking, from a Jewish perspective, according to, you can derive it from Midrash or Remez or Agada. It has to be from a clear statement. That is true. However, at the end of the day, and especially in the Rebbe's Torah view, everything in the Torah, being that it's all one Torah, is all seamless. And therefore, ultimately, one complements the other. A concept to familiarize ourselves with, Tinoik Shenishba, which literally translates a child that was taken captive. This is basically a reference, and especially nowadays, to Jews who can grow up maybe their whole life, not even knowing they're Jewish. They're born into an environment, into a situation where either they're being raised by non-Jews, literally, Tinuk Shenishba, or figuratively, that they're being raised in an environment which they may as well not be being raised by Jews because they know nothing about Judaism. These Jews are Jews by virtue of the fact that they're Jews, and they're very special. When, of course, they're not liable for the fact that they don't know anything because it's not their fault. Another one quick thing, we find this in the first chapter of Pirkei Avos, where Hillel says that we have to all be mitalmidov shel Aaron, and we should be all oyev esabrius, loving the brios. Brios literally means the creatures, the creations of Hashem, umekorvam la Torah, and bring them close to the Torah. As the Alter Rebbe explains, he uses the term brios in order to highlight that we're talking about people who have no other virtue other than the fact that Hashem created them. No other visible qualities or virtues that one can identify other than that fact. Let's go into the actual Sicha. In our Parsha, where it lists the four minim, the four kinds, the four species that one has to take on Sukkos together in order to perform the mitzvah. So it says in chapter 23, verse 40, it says that you need to take, number one, pre-eitz hadar. It has to be a fruit from a tree which is hadar. Hadar means a beautiful fruit, which is an esrog. Then it has to be kapois tmarim, which is basically palms from a date tree, which is the lulav. And then anaf eitz avos, you have to take branches of a tree which are avos, which are intertwined, which is a hadassim. And then arvei nachal, the willow branches of a brook, which is the aravis. However, we find a differentiation. That in the first three, that's the esrog, lulav, and hadassim, the rule is that the description in the pasuk is li'ikuva, meaning that it's mandatory. This is a criteria which is imperative and crucial, that if it's missing, then, for example, if the esrog is not hadar, it's not beautiful because it's totally dried out, it's possible. If, for example, the lulav, the branches, the palms that you take off the date tree are not kapois, they're not kofus. Kofus means like bound. They're not like bound in a manner that we have our put, and they're totally open, totally whacked out, then it's not kosher. And then you have also, for example, in the anaf eitz avos, that it has to be as if it's intertwined, and that's why the hadassim have to have the three leaves coming out from one another. Interestingly, when it comes to the lulav, remember the description is kapois tmarim. It doesn't say from a date tree, but it doesn't say from a palm tree, it says from a date tree. The Rugged Shavar the Goyen, Rabbi Yosef Rosen, points out that lahalacha, this is the way he holds, lahalacha, in order for the lulav to be kosher, it has to come from a tree that actually grows dates. Not a tree that potentially can grow dates. Not from a palm tree, but from a tree that is actually or actively grows dates. Because the Torah says, kapois tmorim, the branches, the palms from a date tree. However, when it comes to the fourth of this species, the fourth kind, which is the arava, it is very clear from the Gemara and from all sources that it does not have to necessarily be from willows that grow near an actual brook. It can even come from willows that grow in a plain field or in a desert even, meaning that there's totally no water there, as long as they are from the same species, from the same sug, from the same min, from the same kind. There is actually a discussion in the Gemara exactly how we derive this. But it seems obvious from the sources, such as the Rambam, that it's like such a clear matter that you don't even need a specific limud. You don't need any extra word or innuendo in the Torah. You don't have to find anything specific to indicate this, because it's so obvious and clear that, bottom line, the arava, the willow branch, does not have to grow in any specific place. In other words, the description that's given in the Torah is not a specific and imperative criteria. It's just that it has to come from that kind, that species, which typically grows at a brook. But if it grows somewhere else, and that's actually the halacha, if it grows somewhere else, it's fine. The question is, of course, we need to understand why the difference. What really is the difference between the first three, esrig, lulav, and hadas, and this fourth one, that they all have to be very specifically meet the criteria of the pasuk, description of the pasuk, and this one does not. Says the Rebbe, as discussed several times, that sometimes there are things in halacha, there are matters in nigla the Torah, in the part of the Torah that's pshat, that really is very much associated with pshat, that you cannot fully and perfectly understand it without dipping into, without taking advantage and getting an appreciation from the other parts of the Torah, meaning from the other means of explaining the Torah, such as drush, such as remez, in order to better understand it, to give us an insight to appreciate it. Says the Rebbe, when we will take advantage of the chelik hadrush, the midrash, on this matter, we will get an absolute understanding and appreciation for this distinction. The Medrash tells us that what is really behind these four species, that they all represent another type of Jew. There are four types. We all know it. The Eserig has both tam and reyach. It has a taste and it has a beautiful aroma. That represents both Torah learning, the one who is big in Torah, and in Maisim Tovim, in good deeds. Lulav, on the other hand, has only the tam. As we said, it comes from a date tree that gives a fruit that has taste. Well, it may lack in Maisim Tovim, but it definitely stands out in Torah, and in fact it stands tall in Torah. Then you have the hadas. It does not stem from a tree that gives off fruits per se. There are some berries that grow on a hadas tree, but that's not really absolute and imperative, and therefore it represents maisim tovim, good deeds, but not so much the tam. Thus, these three come together with the arava. The arava has neither. The arava has neither taste nor aroma, meaning it doesn't have Torah, it doesn't have Maisim Tovim. And the mitzvah is to bring them all together, and to, as it says, to make them aguda achas, to make them into one entity, and that, as it says, Hashem says, the Gemara says, let one come and be mechaper and atone for the other, so to speak, fill up the gap for the other. So what comes out from this? That there is a core and fundamental difference between the first three and this fourth species. The three, the Esrig, Lulav, and Hadas, their criteria is that whatever they're about has to be in the open, it has to be obvious, it has to be visible, in meaning that all qualities have to be there in an active manner. Otherwise, they're not good. And the Rebbe brings the famous saying from the Rebbe Rashab, that he says, quote, a ganef, a thief, is not somebody that could steal, but when do you call somebody a thief? Somebody who actually stole. And he says, likewise, a lamdan, a learned person, a Talmud Chacham, is not somebody that has the potential to learn, but rather somebody who did learn. In other words, these three species, this Esrog, Lulav, and Esrog, Esrog, Lulav, and Hadas, have to have active and actual visible qualities that the Torah prescribes. However, the Arava, that has to be only mimin, from a kind, from the species that grows by the Nachal. This represents people have neither. There's no visible qualities. Just by the virtue of the fact that they are descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, that they are Jewish, which is really a very deeply rooted, almost like an internal, essential quality, but it's not one that's visible. It's a hidden quality. And that is not visible. It's not something we see. And in fact, this can represent even a Jew that doesn't even know that he or she is Jewish. This represents a Yid that is born a Yid as a Tinuk Shenishba, as we described in the introduction, that doesn't have the awareness that they're Jewish, let alone Torah, let alone Nice and Tovim. They don't even know they're Jewish. But the fact that they are born from this, the fact that they come from this kind, quote unquote, from this species, makes them special and has to come together into one bundle. And this, therefore, evolved into halacha. That in order for the first three kinds to be kosher, it has to have the actual qualities that the Torah prescribes. But the Arava, it's enough that they represent the kind, the species, that they come, as we said, descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, that they have a neshama. And it doesn't have to necessarily be in close proximity to the actual brook, to the actual source, so to speak, feeding off Torah and mitzvahs, because like we said, they don't even know that they're Jewish. They all come together, and if one is missing, the whole mitzvah is deficient, is not being fulfilled. And this actually gets expressed, says the Rebbe, in the name of this fourth species. It's called Arava. Arava can also come from the word, as there's a verse in Malachi, the prophet says, "V'orva l'Hashem minchas Yehuda b'Shalayim," that it will be pleasing, it will be sweet to Hashem, the offerings of Yehuda and Yerushalayim. So you see the word Arava, Orva, can mean there's a sweetness. There's a special sweetness here. There's a special quality, a special pleasing effect of bringing this Yid together with all of the other Yidden. It says that ever from here we have a very clear directive, a very obvious one. Number one, we have to connect ourselves to each and every single Jew, even the simplest of Jew, even the simplest Jew that's out there, because you cannot fulfill the mitzvah, meaning you cannot really truly be united as Jews without this Jew. Moreover, the Rebbe says perhaps not only that we have to, quote unquote, include them to make us whole, but perhaps there is actually an advantage to us by connecting to them. Why? Because this Yid that is represented by the Arava is a Pasha to Yid. And because they're Pasha to Yid and they're very simple Jews, there's no qualities, no visible qualities. There's no overt greatness. They represent the Pshitus Ha'atzmus, the simplicity of the essence of Hashem, which is not expressed in any whatsoever expression, not even the loftiest ones. So we actually get to connect to Pshitas Ha'atzmus through the Pashat Yid that we connect to. So in fact, we're not doing them a favor, we're perhaps doing ourselves a favor. Says the Rebbe, there is also a very special hira, a very special directive to those who do have a connection to Torah mitzvahs. What does that mean? As we said, remember we said it's not enough to have these qualities inherently as an inheritance, so to speak, as in our DNA, but it has to be visible, it has to be active. So this is also a lesson to those who are shayach to Torah mitzvahs. It's not sufficient, it's not enough that you come from a family that learns Torah, that you are descendant of people who do good deeds, but you have to have it in you in a revealed manner, in an active, real-time manner. You have to express these qualities. That's as far as we are concerned. People who have the privilege, who grew up with Torah and mitzvahs, who have a shaykhus to Torah and mitzvahs. But when it comes to being mekarev a yid, a pashat yid, then there are no conditions set. Every single yid, as long as they are descendants of Yidden, they are to be invited, they are to be included. And this actually is the meaning of what Hillel means when he says, Oyev es habriyos u'mekarev la'Torah. That when you love the briyos, remember those simple people that have no other quality other than the fact that they're briyos, this love is certain to end off with u'mekarev la'Torah, that you'll certainly bring them closer to the Torah. Says the Rebbe, all this explanation was according to the opinion of the Rogatchover that the lulav has to come from a tree that actually grows tamarim, that actually grows dates. However, there are opposing opinions. There's an opinion, for example, Chassam Sofer, that it doesn't have to necessarily be from a tree that grows, actively grows, produces dates. Rather, it has to be from that same species. So how will we explain it? In other words, what insight do we have? Says the Rebbe, if you look at it now, from this perspective, you can divide the four minim into two categories. You have the esrig and the hadas, which have overt qualities that they are active and in real time, so to speak, giving off their qualities. And then you have the lulav and the harava, which although they're so far apart, but in this sense, they have some kind of common thread. That both of them don't have to necessarily be from ones who are actively involved in their quality, but as long as they come from that species, as long as they come from that source. And another thing they have in common, neither of them has maisim tovim. Remember, the lulav represents Torah. And now we're saying that according to this opinion, it doesn't even have to be from a place that actively is producing Torah, actively giving off the tam, actively giving off the dates, producing the dates. But one thing for sure, they don't have maisim tovim. What can we learn from this? So he says, from this, you can get a certain perspective. That a lulav, meaning one who has a connection to Torah and is lacking maisim tovim, and maybe even their connection to the Torah is lacking, as we said, as long as it comes from there, but they're not really actively so involved, and therefore certainly their maisim tovim is hurting. In a sense, they are worse. They have a much greater problem than the one who's represented in the Arava. Why? Because the one who's represented in the Arava doesn't know that he's a Jew. He doesn't know anything. He's a simple Yid. It maybe barely knows that he's Jewish. Or, like we said, it represents even a Tinuk Shanishba. But here you're talking about somebody who has a connection to Torah, and yet he's lacking in Maisim Tovim. And maybe even his Torah is lacking. And we know that the Gemara says that one who has Torah and doesn't do mitzvahs is far worse than somebody who doesn't know. Says the Rebbe, here's the Hira. Here is the directive. Even such a Jew, especially such a Jew, you have to bring him closer. And you have to make sure and encourage him to become part of the pack, to become one, to become unified with all other Jews, and to love him as all other Jews. It says the Rebbe, from here you have a very interesting directive. That from a certain perspective, those people who are involved in Torah need to be, you have to be mekar of them, even more than the Yid that perhaps is represented in the Arava. There are those who make the simple calculation, the obvious one, that when it comes to a Yid that's so distant from Yiddishkeit, he's like Arava, he barely knows he's Jewish. There it's a situation of pikuach nefesh, and therefore you have to pursue him, to be mekar of him. But a Yid who's involved in Torah, and maybe he's lacking in other areas, in Maisim Tovim, Avodas Hashem, you don't have to really spend all the time with him, because it's not really such an emergency, so it seems to some, because the fact is that they are involved in Torah. They have a connection. It says the Rebbe here, you see a lesson that you have to bring him in. You have to pursue him. And you have to actually make an effort to make that unity, to bring them together. It's not enough to just attract, to just be mekarev, the Arava type of Jew, but you have to also be mekarev, the Lulav type of Jew. And then gets fulfilled what Chazal say, Yechapru Elu al Elu, that they will literally the translation of that is that they will atone one for another. But what is really the purpose of kapara? As the Alter Rebbe says in Igeres HaTshuva, lechaper lifnei Hashem, what does it mean to be atoned before Hashem? Means lias nachas ruach l'koyra, to be a pleasant existence before Hashem. That to become pleasant before Hashem, to the extent that Hashem says, as he says in reference to the mitzvah of Lulav and Esrog, that when you bring all Jews together, Hashem says, Ani mis'ala, even I get elevated through this. By them getting elevated, now I get boosted up, I get elevated, and this certainly brings to the Geula, the true redemption, as it says in the Medrash Tanchuma, Ein Yisrael Nigalim, that we will not get redeemed from Galus, Achiyu Kulam Aguda Echas, until we have all together, come together all as one bond, one Aguda, all together united.